everyone. I'm Kristen Anderson, Adult Services Clerk here at McCracken County Public Library.
And I'm Nathan Lynn, Library Assistant and with the Local and Family History Department here at the McCracken County Public Library.
And today we are bringing you the second in our series on how to find on our genealogy series, how to find your roots, how to build a tree, all of those things. And today's topic is going to be the census. We're going to go deep into the census, what it means, how it came about, each year that's available, what information you can find there. Before I let Nathan really give us the history of the census, I do want to mention that the information we're going to give you today is probably 85% fact-based, 15% are opinions, because we are going to discuss some of the, I'll say, quirkier pieces of the census, as well as some tips and those kinds of things. The 15% opinion part, those opinions are mine and Nathan's, all right? They do not necessarily reflect those of McCracken County Public Library. So please remember that. And Nathan, why don't you get us started? Tell us about the census, bud.
Yeah, so the United States Census is primarily what we're going to talk about today, the federal census. And the federal population census is an inventory of everyone living in the United States and taken for the purpose of determining your House of Representatives. So a census is generally a count and description of the population of a country, state, county, or city at any given date.
Okay.
You can kind of think about this as a snapshot of one day in either a person or a household's life.
Oh, that's nice. I like that.
Yeah. So it's a very specific moment because that could change at any other time. Every individual contacted by the United States government is required by law to give this information, and they list all kinds of things. The first census might not list quite as many things, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, but as the years have gone on, the federal census has asked for more and more information. Something to keep in mind is that when researching the census, there could be discrepancies that you find, and those could be for a number of reasons. One could be that the enumerator or person asking the questions might have heard the person who was being asked the questions wrong and wrote the information down. The other option is the other person could have lied on the census. So there are some discrepancies that you have to keep in mind there that could happen. So the United States Federal Census covers a pretty large section of our history. The first census started in 1790. And we just took our last census last year in 2020, as many of you probably did as well. Because of privacy laws, though, census are not released until 72 years after they are taken. So currently we have access to the 1940 census. In April of 2022, we will have access to the
1950 census.
Correct. So we're very excited.
I'm very excited
as
about
a genealogist, it's very exciting, and just as people interested in United States history, it's very exciting to think about this new set of records that's going to be available to us soon. There are some census that are missing some sections, and we'll talk about those. But for the most part, as you progress through the years, the more information you will be able to learn about the person or persons that you're researching. As the years go on, you're going to learn more and more information because the federal government asked more of individuals that were taking the census as the years progressed. So I guess we should start with 1790.
Very boring. But
The 1790 census is a little stale, if you know what I mean. No, there is a lot of information in the 1790 United States Federal Census, but it is very limited. And that holds true up until about 1840. For those census, you're pretty much going to get the head of the household, if they were a male white citizen owning property. You also will get a head count of free persons and enslaved persons on these census. You will not get a list of those people's names, most likely.
No.
So from about 1790 census to about the 1840 census, if you were not a head of the household, you would just get a check mark. And you'll be able to see this here on our examples of these census that we're showing here. So they can be very tricky to decipher who is in each census. But if you know that your family member was of a certain age in 1830 and you know their parent, you can probably look at the check marks and say, oh, this person is between the age of 10 and 20, and you can say that's probably them. But they are very hard to read, and if you would like more help with that, you could always contact us here at the library, and we could give you some more tips on that. But beginning in about 1850, we start to see a lot more information being asked by the United States government as they were giving these census. And this is when the world of genealogy for American genealogists really opens up, in my opinion.
Yeah. So 1850, first of all, it has name, age, and gender of each family member. And that was pretty important. I looked at a couple of 1830, 1840 census. 1840, I think it had like first initial and last name, which just did not help at all. So having a name, having an age, having a gender is very important. You also get occupation, birthplace, and if they were married that year. Now, another thing that they started doing in 1850 is they introduced slave schedules. Now, as Nathan mentioned in the earlier census, slaves were totaled on the household page as an enslaved person. They separated them by sex and by age. The slave schedules do sort of the same thing, except they were just taken in the slaveholding states, and they have the name of the slave owner, and then for the slaves, they are listed just with age and their sex. So this is the 1850 and the 1860 slave schedule. So unless you know exactly where your ancestors are enslaved, you aren't going to really be able to get a lot of information out of the slave schedules. A later video that we're going to do, we are going to talk about how I did some research in my family and was able to use the slave schedules. But for the most part, that information isn't as great as I would like it to be. Isn't as useful as I would like it to be. Also, in 1860, they still had the same information as they did in 1850. They didn't really add anything to each one of those. If you are a descendant of an enslaved person, such as myself, you're still not going to be able to find anything about your ancestors except through the slave schedules. But we get to 1870, and that's where you start seeing the enslaved, the now emancipated slaves. They're listed in the census. And 1870 added only whether the father and mother are of foreign birth, because we also started getting a lot of immigrants around that time. That information is listed on there as well. And then you have the enslaved people, the emancipated slaves, and they are now listed in the census with their households. What I noticed for those in 1870, it will say inferred children. So it'll list head of household, because again, we are a very patriarchal society, no matter what your race is. They will list the head of household, and then they will list inferred wife, inferred children. And I'm not really sure why they did that. I don't know if they just didn't know or if it was just easier to do that. And that inferred part, that comes from where Ancestry, Family Search, MyHeritage, Heritage Quest, that's their annotated version, not the actual record. The annotated version will say, that we're showing you now will show inferred. The actual record will show may show something different. I'm not really sure why they went to the slave schedules in 50 and 60. I'm assuming it was for tax purposes. Slaves were property. They were traded as property. They were taxed as property. And maybe that made it easier to collect taxes because our government has always loved collecting taxes.
Indeed.
Indeed. So you're out there, you're rocking, you found your family in 1860 and 70 and 80, and then you jump to 1900. Nathan, why is that?
Well, unfortunately, the 1890 census burned in a fire at the United States Commerce Department building January of 1921. The fire was devastating, and it nearly completely destroyed the 1890 census, which is a huge loss for genealogists and historians worldwide, not only now but for generations to come. It's hard to fathom this because you're really losing 20 years because your last census was in 1880 and your next census won't be until 1900. So you've lost 20 years pretty much of documentation. Some things remained, but fewer than, I think, 6,000 or something names remain that are searchable from the 1890 United States Federal Census. And those are on 3 rolls of census, I think.
I'm very sad about
There
that.
was a veteran census taken in the 1890s, though. And if you were a descendant of a Union veteran in the United States Civil War, you could use that census, the veteran census, to try to fill in some blanks. So there are some ways around this loss of census, some tax rolls, which we'll talk about in other videos as well. But the 1890 census was a huge loss being burned. We have a blank census sheet that you can see, and it would tell you here how much information was lost. And there were a lot of things that had been added from the 1880 census that we would have learned through the 1890 census. But alas, we did not. So you move on to 1900, and the 1900 census, we see a huge addition of things. By 1900, you're getting full names, you're getting number of years in your current marriage, the month and year of birth. So this info could be, can be a little inaccurate, it just depends. Mother of how many children? If you're a mother, you have to say how many children you're the mother of.
That is a boon to me, particularly having lost that 1890 census.
Totally.
Now you can okay, there's a child I'm missing somewhere. If you see the difference between the number living and the number of children born, you can kind of know you've got to do some more digging.
Yeah,
and that's helpful.
And it does list, that's another question, number of living children, not just how many children are you the mother of. It also asks a naturalization status if you are a naturalized citizen, if your papers have been submitted, and so on and so on. A year of immigration, and how many years you've lived in the United States. So the 1900 census is really, we lost 1890, but we're getting some new things going here. But then 1910, we drop a couple of things. So the 1910 census drops the month and year of birth.
I found that incredibly helpful to have. So 1900 is probably my favorite census, if that sounds weird, but it really is.
We're getting too much information.
Yeah.
We better backtrack. It also drops the number of the years that you've been in the United States, which is strange to me because you're still seeing a large group of people immigrating to the United States. And
we've always been concerned with immigration, so
yes.
I don't know why they...
It does add, though, if you were a veteran of the Civil War, which is pretty late to be adding that at that point. Like, why didn't they add that in the earlier?
More than 40, the way they wait 40 years?
1870 would have been a good year to start that, in my opinion. But, hey, here we are. So by the 1910 and 1920 census, you're seeing a vary in things being added and dropped. They're starting to say, oh, this is more important to us than this.
Yeah. So your 1920, you dropped the number of years married, and that was always helpful to me when I'm doing my research, but fine, I don't have that information anymore. It also dropped the number, the mother of children and how many are living, and the Civil War veteran. So they had it in one census and decided they didn't want it anymore. So, okay.
I'm sure that was a pension thing, probably. They were thinking
Oh,
we might
maybe.
be needing to pay pensions because there were pensions paid.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah.
You're right about that. Also, 1920 adds the year of naturalization, your native language, and the native language of your father and mother. So that kind of helps with a little of that immigration stuff that's gotten dropped. Again, 1900 is my favorite census. But 1930, we dropped native language of father and mother. We don't care anymore. And we add your age at your first marriage. We don't care how long you've been married, just how old were you when you first got married. And a military veteran and what war.
I like that approach.
Yeah, we're kind of backing back into the Civil War thing, but at this point we've had World War I, right?
Correct.
We're on the verge of World War II, and there's a bunch of we're also a warring country. So now you've kind of got that information back in the census. And that can help you jump into fold 3 in your military records and know which ancestors you need to go find some more information on.
Totally. I like the approach to your to finding out if a person was a veteran that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it gives you a little more information about them as opposed to just Civil War veterans.
That's a good point. I like that. 1940, and this is the last available census that we have. It drops your age at first marriage. So again, we had that in one census. They didn't want it anymore. Father's and mother's birthplace. Military veteran, which war? So now we don't care if you're a military veteran anymore. Year of immigration and your native language.
Roller coaster of information here.
You get some census are really good for you, and then some you just drop stuff. It's like Nathan said, it's a bit of a roller coaster. Yeah. But that's all. That's the information that you can find in your census, and for each decade that we have it. So we're going to go back now, and we're going to talk a little in depth about what I call some of the quirkier things in our census, and we're going to give you some tips on how to use the census records to build your tree and to find your family history. And let's dive into the 1890 census because, oh boy. Okay, so I didn't know we had any out there. I knew there was some that was preserved. I never found any, but I went looking for it. Use Heritage Quest. You can go right to the decade that you're searching for. And I brought up an 1890 census. First of all, what I really enjoyed is that it wanted to know your Christian name. Yes, we have freedom of religion in the Constitution, but we want you to have a Christian name.
That's right.
Okay, that's something.
The layout all around is different of the census. The whole census roll. If you understand what landscape versus portrait mode is, all the other censuses have been in landscape.
Yeah.
Whereas this census, I guess not all of them, but last couple,
most of
them are in landscape.
Yeah. This is a weird. Yeah, you're right. The layout's weird, and it was one sheet per family.
Maybe the 1880 census is in portrait mode, and it didn't switch till after that. I'm learning something as we talk here.
I think you're right.
Visit your local library. You'll learn something every day.
Always.
But they ask a lot of questions on the 1890 census. Very in depth. Wanting to know a lot of information.
My favorite question on the 1890 census, and this actually blew Nathan's mind when I looked at it a couple weeks ago. It wants to know your nationality, your race, and it asks if you are white, black, Indian,
yes,
which is a very offensive term, but not necessarily offensive depending on how they were intending it. Mm-hmm. Chinese. And then if you were a quadroon, which means you are 1/4 black, or octoroon, meaning you are 1/8 black. And Nathan had never heard the term octoroon before. He looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. I'm like, it's a real thing. I promise. And it seemed to me the government was very, very concerned about if the races were mixing, is what I took it as. I may be wrong about that, but that's what I took it as.
I don't know the intent, but they were obviously intent on knowing something.
Yes, exactly.
And I got to thinking more about this, and at first I was like, I'd never heard of these things, but then I thought, from a genealogist standpoint, it could be helpful.
That's a very good point, because then you'd know to go looking for some of those relatives that were on your tree you didn't know about.
Right. Unfortunately, it was in the 1890 census and it burned, so it doesn't matter anyways.
Sorry.
You know? But I will say this is a great topic when it comes to identifying race or nationality in the United States Federal Census. And you really have to, there's a lot to wrap your head around.
Definitely.
Because there are numerous ways that people are listed. Sometimes it's by nationality, sometimes it's by skin color.
Yep.
And if it's by skin color, sometimes it is in the eye of the beholder, the person who was at your house taking this information down. So they use their own discretion sometimes to decide what they would write on this.
I found a census record, and I think I kept it. It may be on the screen right now. I can't remember if I clipped it, but it had a name, and I think it was something like Ramirez. And when you looked at the record that Ancestry brought up for you, like the readable record, I'll say.
Transcript.
Transcript. Thank you. Thank you. That's the word I've been looking for all day. Thank you, Nathan.
I got you.
The transcribed record, it said that this person was Hispanic. And I was like, okay. And when you look at what was actually written on the image, it was Chinese. It said Hispanic, but his parents were born in China, and I was very confused about that, especially in it was like 1880, 1890, something like that. That confused me to no end. So as Nathan said, some of this information is based on what the enumerator sees, not necessarily what they ask. And in some places, the transcriber transcribes it as white, and then underneath it'll say Hispanic. So even though the census image has CH for Chinese, or it'll have, I think it's either L or H for Hispanic, the transcriber will say white and then have Hispanic underneath. So just be real careful when you're looking up your records to look at both. Look at both the transcribed record and the image, because sometimes they do differ.
Totally. Look at the original document. I mean, I'm a proponent of that. Using the transcription is great to find and get initial.
It finds it quickly.
But I like to pull up that document and look at it. The listing of nationality and race. I mean, this is a whole other episode that we could talk on this, and you will get, if you trace the same person, you will get different enumerators writing different things down. My
great-grandfather was mulatto and black, and then went back to mulatto and back to black. And I was like, okay, what?
And maybe he was telling them.
And that could be something that he was telling great-great-grandfather, not my great. Continuing on this nation's slight obsession with race, the 1910, that's right, Native American census. They had a census. The 1919 census had specific questions just for Native Americans. You want to talk a little bit more about that? So
before that, indigenous people were not asked different questions on the census. Starting in, I think, 1860, in 1860, you start seeing indigenous people living in the general population identified for the first time as Indian. But before that, it was not quite as common to be able to find those folks. But in 1900 and 1910, you start seeing some questions asking where they are living, if they have another name, the name of the tribe affiliation, and different things. There are some census rolls that can help you besides this with this information, but unfortunately, prior to that, we were not, the United States government, the federal government was not taking down that information as well as they probably should have, in my personal opinion.
A couple other things that they asked on the Native American census that, boy, did my eyebrows raise. They again asked about mixed blood, if you were full Native American, or if you had white blood or black blood, and if so, how much. They also asked if you were polygamist, if you had more than one wife, And if so, and I still don't know why this is important, if your wives were sisters.
Interesting.
And I have no idea why. I wish I knew why that one piece was important.
You probably don't wish you
But
did.
I may not wish I knew what it was. They also ask if you getting your land grant, I think in 1790, 1800 maybe, I don't remember when, they did some land grants to Native Americans. So it asked if you got your land grant and when. And I thought the tribe information was both interesting to have and important. I did not understand what the rest of that stuff was for. I didn't get it.
It's an interesting time for me, in my opinion, to start asking indigenous folks these questions.
Yes.
Like, we should have been asking these questions from the beginning, but
If we just dying to know, yeah.
and
correct.
there are some other reports that can help you if your ancestors are indigenous people, and you're always welcome to come to the library and ask one of the assistants to try to help you with those resources as well. But it is not as researched by the United States federal government through census as I personally feel like it should have been.
Yeah.
That's just my opinion.
I agree with you on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's move into some tips for how you can use the census.
Sure.
Before we get into that, another couple oddities. If your ancestor was in a facility for the mentally disabled, they would be listed in that facility as I believe they listed them as inmates. I don't know if they said, I think it said inmates actually.
Or it might be blank of why.
Or it might be blank. Yeah, I looked at Western State Hospital in Hopkinsville. We're probably all aware of that, at least, and how they were listed. Also, prisoners. If your ancestor was in prison, they are listed and counted in the state in which they are imprisoned. And it'll just have their name and if they're an inmate. It doesn't have any of this other information that we talked about in the census. There is a movement right now, it's just getting off the ground, to count prisoners in their home state and not where they're imprisoned. Because, as Nathan said at the outset of this video, the House of Representatives
population schedule
depended on having accurate populations. And if you have someone that may have been imprisoned in 1940, but they were back in their home state in 1942, well, that state's lost that count. So that's just something to keep in mind.
You want to buff those stats? We need a new penitentiary down the street here.
That's you're not right about. You're not wrong. You're not wrong about that.
Just making observations as an American citizen.
Opinions.
Yes,
that's what they are.
I would also like to point out the 1940 census has an addition of where you were living in 1935, but it only asked this to like every 10 people. I don't know why they chose like that. Why didn't they just ask everyone? Because it's a world of information. If your ancestor happens to be one of these chosen special people that was in line, you can get all this extra information about where they were at in 1935. So you're getting your ancestor at a 5-year gap, which is great. So
it's pretty sweet.
That's a
I have a couple
oddity.
of those.
I did too, and I loved it. I was like, oh, cool. My granddad's one of them. Awesome. Yeah.
All right. I'm gonna give you some tips now. Both Nathan and I are tips on how to use this information, how to search, how to find this information, and my tips mainly come from my own work in building my family tree. I'm up to about 2,000 some odd people right now in my tree. I've been working on it several years. First of all, let's go back to the first time your emancipated slaves appeared in the census back in 1870, 1880. So the last name of your ancestor could be one of, in my opinion, 4 things. It could either be the direct name of who enslaved them. It could also be a modification of that name. It can be a name of a prior owner that went with them when they were bought. Or it could be a name they just came up with on their own. So if you were thinking that maybe you could use that to find them in the slave schedule, that doesn't always work out. It did for me, but that doesn't always work out because it only worked out for me. I have 8 great-great-great-grandparents. I only found 1. So, so the search engines, I'm sorry, the last name may be spelled differently across multiple census, and even more fun, multiple children can spell that name differently.
Yes.
In my family, for example, I have, in one family, brothers, sisters, Snarden, Snowden, Snaden, and Snorton. And when I tell you it's a pain trying to piece all that together, it's a pain trying to piece all that together to build my tree properly. But that's what they did. They took their name and some of that, I think, I can't decide if it's the enumerator, how they spelled it, or how they were given it. So I'll look at a bunch of Snortons and I'm like, oh, I could be related to them because I had Snowden, I had, all these different names in my ancestry. That was just one family. I'm talking mother, father, children. So that's another quirky thing about the census, could make it a little difficult for you to pick out your.
This is a reoccurring theme that I have spent my career here at the library trying to explain to people. I'll be helping them with their genealogy, and I have a pretty good idea. I found the person they're looking for, and then they will say, they didn't spell it like that.
Exactly.
And I'm like, so then I have to explain, well, it could have been written down wrong. They could have, there's so many options on, they could have changed the name, the spelling of the name.
They could have done that as well. Mm-hmm.
They could have dropped the O from O'Reilly, or there's so many things that could have happened. So just because it doesn't line up right on one census, and to add to this, just because the first name is not the same, I have seen people switch their first name.
Oh my gosh.
Or use their middle name.
Thank you for bringing that up.
So look deep into these people. If you have genealogy is taking a bunch of different pieces of information and trying to link them to that person. And if you have 9 out of 10 pieces, but the one thing is a clerical error in spelling, you might want to check that because it could still be that person.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. I have relatives that the first census was a nickname, the second census was the middle name, and the third one was the first name. And I'm like, oh my gosh.
No doubt. Yeah.
Also, another thing is, especially with those who are descendants of emancipated slaves, the slave owners named the slaves after themselves. Okay, in some cases, and they also name their children after themselves. So when you're pulling up census records, make sure that the quote-unquote Sam Smith you pulled up is your Sam Smith and not that of either a completely different family, that of the slave owner, etc. And you can use the race and other factors to determine that it's your Sam Smith as opposed to a different Sam Smith. Also, a lot of people still do this today, named after brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles. So I may be a Sam who named my child Brian after my brother Brian, who also named one of his kids Brian, who then named one of his kids Brian. So make sure that when you're looking that you use, as Nathan said, multiple pieces of information that you have to know that this is your relative, your family belongs in this spot on your tree.
All of you expecting parents out there, think long and hard
Indeed.
before you go with John William Smith III or 14th, because your future ancestors, although now we have DNA tracing that could help you a little bit, but still. That has caused a lot of problems through genealogy.
Indeed. In the 1880 census, we mentioned it adds the relationship to the head of household. Pay close attention to that because you can have grandchildren, niece, nephew, sister-in-law, brother-in-law, and that can help you, again, build a fuller picture of your family.
Totally.
I had a granddaughter listed on one of my census, one of my ancestor census, but the mother of that child wasn't living with my great-great-grandmother. And so it took me quite a while to figure out the reason when she had passed away. But because I had these grandchildren, I knew where to start. I knew I needed to do more digging. I didn't just shrug and move on.
Yeah, that's an awesome piece of information that they give there, knowing what head of household kin to who is living in there.
Yes.
Sometimes I shrug at the term head of household. At the time, that's what was being used. But knowing that was the uncle, then you can say, oh, well, this is, it really helps fill in a lot of your family history there.
Indeed. And remember, that can be on either side. So if I have a niece, it could be head of household's sister's child, brother's child, or it could be wife's, sister's child, mother's child.
Or it could say border.
Yeah.
Someone could just be living with someone.
Yes, I have several of my ancestors that were boarders in families.
Doesn't help you as much.
It did a little bit, because then I have an ancestor who wound up marrying a boarder.
Wow. At last.
So in the next census, they were a married couple, and I was like, oh, all right.
Yeah.
I do want to implore again, look at the record itself, the image, not just look at the transcribed record. I have been able to find in-laws this way, because especially in the 1870s, 1880s, families lived next door to each other. They lived together. So I actually couldn't find I believe it's my paternal great-great-grandmother. And I actually got a friend here that used to work here to help me out. And she noticed that my great-great-grandfather lived next door to a married couple. And she was like, I think that's his in-laws. I think that's her parents. And then I pulled together some other pieces of information and was able to determine, oh, yes, it was. I had another, my great-great-great-grandfather, his sister lived and worked for his wife's family. And I wouldn't have known that unless I hadn't brought up the full image and kind of scanned all the people that lived around him.
This is a great point, and the same person that helped you with that taught me this, that a lot of times bloodlines travel together. I think that's I don't know the exact phrasing, but so over 100, 200 years, a lot of times you will find the same families
Indeed.
moving to the same areas and being close to each other. And what you said about looking at your neighbors, if you think about time periods and when people didn't travel quite as much,
That's
and you
true.
still see this today, but people often married someone close
Yes.
to where they were living. So if you're looking for someone, you can always scan the census. Don't just use the search engine, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're using Family Search or Ancestry or the United States Census or the Archives, United States Archives, whatever database you're using, you can go to the census record and you can look record by record. So you could look through a whole county roll. If you wanted to look in Paducah, 1st Precinct or 1st District, you could just read every one. Don't just use the search, because
Exactly.
I've had to go and look at the physical records because whoever typed it out didn't type it out right. Another thing to remember with this, if you can't find someone in the 1930 census, for instance, you knew that they should be living in that city that they were living at in 1920, you can compare the 1920 census, go to the 1930, and then browse the 1930 census, find their neighbors. Maybe you search their neighbors and find them. So what you were saying about looking at the neighborhood and where the folks are living is very important. Don't just go by what is typed in the information.
Exactly. Another thing to not go by as well, or to be cautious of, I'll say, if you use Ancestry, and I use Ancestry, that's almost exclusively what I use to build my tree. When you search for someone, use that search engine, it gives you related searches. So it'll give you related records. Those records are built based on the name, the location, and also other people who have searched those same people. So if you have a distant relative you don't know, a distant cousin or whatever, that has attached an incorrect record, to the family tree, you'll get served this incorrect record every single when you look up the same person. So make sure that when you use those related records, which I have a lot and they've helped me a lot, do as Nathan said earlier and pack it with 9 or 10, 9 pieces of other information to make sure that that is the correct information. Because I have had related records come up incorrect and they weren't the person that I was looking for.
It always fascinates me how many people have the same names.
Yes.
And
it shouldn't, but it does.
I'm like, how could there be this person with this really odd name? And there'll be like 10 people, and you're like, oh, well. Now, I get some names can be really hard, but sometimes it's like a really odd name, and maybe I'm just wrong on maybe it's not an odd name.
No, you're right. It's odd. But there's just a lot of people that are named that.
And you get caught in that loop of ancestry of the click, and so then if I click on it, then the next person, the algorithm is going to show them that he clicked on this, so they're probably related when they might not be related at all.
Exactly. Another thing on that, and I have gone blank because I don't remember what I was going to say, and it was...
That's okay. Sometimes there will be blank sheets in the United States Census. It's true.
That's helpful.
Yeah. And especially, I've noticed this, we were talking about inmates. Mm-hmm. For people incarcerated or people in some sort of institution or a hospital, it might just list their name, and that is all for the time. So that's a tough one. But if you do find that, at least you know where they were at during that time. Maybe you could contact that place and get more information on them if it was a hospital or a jail or whatnot. Yeah,
that's a good point. Well, another piece of information that's just become available to Ancestry, but it's been available in other places for a long time, is the Freedmen's Bureau. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I believe starting in 1865 and up until about 1875, 73 maybe, I don't know the exact date, there were numerous records taken with former enslaved people. And they encompass a lot of different areas and record types, and you can learn more about those now on Ancestry.com. You can also find those on Family Search and numerous other areas, but that's another great place for you to search for records. And that leads me to think of there's also different types of census. Today we've mainly talked about the United States Federal Census, but there are some state census, some agricultural census that could help you, specifically in 1890 if you were looking. Yeah. So there are a lot of other records that fall kind of under the umbrella of census that aren't federal census that could help you as well. I'm rambling.
No, you're fine.
Rambling.
I forgot to mention that. I forgot, or to lead you to mention it. Yeah. So either way, I'm glad we got that information out there. Do you have any other tips besides the things that I mentioned to help people build their tree?
I guess my biggest tip here is that, to me, the United States Federal Census is the first go-to thing when you, besides talking to your relatives, always.
That's true.
Talking to your living relatives. The United States Federal Census is going to most likely house more information for you than most other records that you can find. Because if you find a city directory record, let's say, it's going to list the person's place, their name, and it's going to be 1 year. Yeah. Maybe their occupation, okay?
Sometimes their birthday.
Sometimes their birthday. Okay, maybe it is listing a lot more. But I do feel like the census is easier to track people and find more out about them. So that's the first place that I send people to. To me, it's the go-to for people doing genealogy. I would also like to say about the United States Census is don't give up.
Absolutely.
Because there could be a wrong transcription in the scans. I encourage you to visit multiple sites where the census is available. If you can't find it on Ancestry, don't give up. Go visit Family Search. Go visit Heritage Quest. Visit MyHeritage. These other places, the archives.org. Try to find another site and search for the records there because it might take you a long time, but
it has for me. I've recently come across census records for relatives, either because I found out, a married name, or because I looked at the image and realized, oh, this person wasn't enumerated or wasn't listed correct, wasn't transcribed. So yeah, I still find census records for relatives I thought I had long settled in my tree and was done with.
Yeah.
So.
And also, if you would like to help transcribe the next census next year, most sites that host the census are always looking for free transcriptions, and some people look at it as like a video game. So in April of next year, when the census comes out, you can visit these different places, and you could go to your ancestors page and you could type out the information and enter that. Sometimes that's
cool.
a fun game.
Yeah.
You know.
It could be fun.
Yeah. One last thing I would like to mention, and some people don't do this, but you can print off blank census forms. So you could print off the blank 1880 census. If you had problems reading that, you could then fill the information in yourself. And those are available on numerous sites online as well if you're ever interested in that, because sometimes they're hard to read.
Yes, they are. I had a relative that was listed as a PPU, and I was like, what the heck is that? It was nephew.
Ah.
It was just spelled really horribly on the actual image.
I love my PPU. If you're watching out there, buddy, I love you. You're my buddy. I'm going to use that. I'm putting that in my vocabulary.
You're going to put it in your vocabulary.
Yeah.
So we're going to wrap up today. Heritage Quest, My Heritage,
Yes.
and until December, correct?
Yes.
Ancestry is available through our website, mclib.net.
Yes.
What's the drop down? It's
you can click on Learn, or you can click,
there you go.
and then Local and Family History.
Thank you.
And you can find those databases to search your records. We should mention that right now, unfortunately, the Local and Family History Room is closed to public access, but we can always get books out of Local and Family History Room and bring them out to you. We also will always help you with your research requests and try to spend at least an hour researching for you. If you have questions, you can hit us up at our website, on our Facebook, through the telephone, Instagram. Hit me on my beeper. I don't know. What other forms do we have?
Oh, and the email questions.
Questions at mclib.net. You could telepathically reach me. I do work in that type of work sometimes. So
I've tried that. It works sometimes. I mean,
Sometimes.
notice we're kind of dressed
Look at
alike
this.
today.
You see this?
So, yeah.
Third eye
Synergy.
stuff. Yeah.
Also, Nathan mentioned that the Family Local History is now closed. It is due to the current spread, although I think we're plateaued of the Delta variant. Nathan and I have both been vaccinated.
We have indeed.
And we, as far as we know, have not been around anyone who does have COVID-19. So we taped this together without masks today. But as soon as that record button goes off and I hit that door, my mask will be back on.
Me
Trust.
too. Yeah. Thanks a lot, everyone. We're here to provide access, and we're very thankful for you watching. And please visit us at www.mclib.net. Until next time, I am Nathan Lynn.
I'm Kristen Anderson.
And we'll see you soon.